If God created the universe, then who created God? Now, before we dive into the theological rabbit hole, let's set something straight. This isn't just a modern question, nor is it a challenge invented by atheists to stump religious people. No, this question goes way back. Philosophers, theologians, even ancient scholars wrestled with this idea. And today it's still one of the most debated and controversial topics out there. So how does Christianity answer this? Well, the answer is both simple and mind-blowing. God wasn't created. The Bible, particularly in Revelation 1 verse 8, is crystal clear on this. God says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." He's saying, I'm eternal. I have no beginning, no end. I just am. Now, what does that even mean? Let's break it down. In Christianity, God isn't bound by time or space. He's eternal. He exists outside the rules of cause and effect that we humans are stuck with. You see, everything we know, every tree, every planet, every galaxy, everything has a beginning, right? You were born. I was born. Even the universe had a birth. Ever heard of the Big Bang? But for God, time doesn't work the same way. Let's bring in Thomas Aquinas, one of the OG Christian philosophers from the 13th century. Aquinas had something to say about this. He proposed what's called the first cause argument. In his famous work, Summa Theologica, he said, look, everything in the universe has a cause, but you can't keep going back forever. At some point, there has to be an uncaused cause. And that, my friends, is God. God is the uncaused cause. He's the one who set everything into motion without anyone or anything creating him. Pretty slick, right? But here's where it gets juicy. Critics, especially modern ones like Richard Dawkins, aren't having it. Dawkins, in his best-selling book The God Delusion, fired back with this: if God created the universe, then who created God? He argues that invoking God doesn't solve the problem. It just kicks the question up a notch. He essentially says, hey, if you're going to say the universe needs a cause, why doesn't God need a cause too? Dawkins isn't the first to push back like this, but his criticism definitely revived the debate in recent years, especially in the science versus religion sphere. And speaking of science, let's take a look at Stephen Hawking. He wasn't shy about chiming in on this either. Hawking, in his book The Grand Design, suggested that the universe could have created itself out of nothing, without the need for a divine creator at all. No God required. His idea challenges the traditional Christian view, suggesting that the universe's origins can be explained purely by the laws of physics. Now, this obviously sets up a major clash with theistic views, especially those who hold that God is the necessary first cause. But here's the kicker. The Bible doesn't shy away from this question, it actually leans into it. When Moses asked God for his name in Exodus 3 verse 14, God responded, I am who I am. That's deep. What does it even mean? Well, God is essentially saying, I just am. I exist without cause, without origin. I am the very definition of existence itself. This statement makes it clear God is the only being in existence who doesn't need an explanation for his existence. Everything else in the universe? Sure, but not him. It's not just a biblical claim either. This ties into what many theologians describe as God's lay sight. Fancy word, right? It basically means that God's existence is self-derived. He doesn't rely on anything or anyone to exist. In simpler terms, God exists because God exists. That's the Christian view, and it's been held for millennia. But of course, this doesn't satisfy everyone. Many skeptics argue that the whole God has no beginning concept is just a way of dodging the question. They'll say things like it's a convenient excuse, or that doesn't make sense. Everything else has to have a beginning, and I get it. Our brains are wired to think everything must have a cause. That's how our universe works. But according to Christian theology, God is different. He's on a whole other level, and this is where the debate gets intense. You've got people on one side saying God is the ultimate answer. He's eternal, he doesn't need a creator, he simply is. Then, on the other side, you've got people like Dawkins and Hawking challenging that, saying it's just an attempt to dodge the question. Let's talk about one of the most mind-boggling concepts in Christianity, God's eternal nature. Yeah, you heard that right. God's eternal nature, eternal. We're talking about a God who exists outside of time, space, and anything remotely close to what we experience every single day. Here's the deal: Christianity is built on this idea that God has no beginning and no end. He didn't start anywhere, and he sure as heck won't end either. In fact, Revelation 22 verse 13 makes this bold statement, where God says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end." Now, if that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. But what does this really mean? This isn't some metaphorical language. Christianity teaches that God literally exists outside the constraints of time, like he's not aging, he's not moving through history, he's just there. Past, present, future, it's all the same to him. This is where things get wild, because we're so used to living within time, right? I mean, we count days, we watch the clock, we age. Everything we know has a ticking clock attached to it. But God? He's on a whole different wavelength. So let's take this concept further. Throughout the Bible, you see this idea that God was always there. He wasn't born. He didn't just show up. He's been present since before creation. Take a look at Psalm 90 verse 2. It says, "Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." That's right, folks, from everlasting to everlasting. That's not just some poetic language, that's a theological claim that God always existed, even before anything else did. Now, this raises some serious questions, doesn't it? Like, how do you even wrap your head around that? Our brains are wired to understand things in terms of beginnings and endings. You're born, you live, you die. Everything follows that same pattern. But when we talk about God's eternal nature, we're in completely uncharted territory. There's no start button, no origin story for God. He just is. To make things even more interesting, this isn't some late-game theological addition to Christianity. Oh no, this idea goes all the way back to the Old Testament. Look at Isaiah 40 verse 28, where it says, "The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom." This passage is laying it all out. God doesn't get tired, he doesn't age, he doesn't have the limitations we do. He's been around forever, and he'll be around forever. Now, this isn't just a random quirk of Christian belief, it's foundational. Think about it. If God was created, then he wouldn't really be God, right? He'd just be another part of the created order, another being subject to time, decay, and limitations. But the whole point of God in Christianity is that he stands outside of that. He's the one who set it all into motion, not a product of it. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential early Christian thinkers, talked a lot about this. He lived in the 4th century, and his writings are still shaping how we think about God today. Augustine was obsessed with time and eternity. In his monumental work Confessions, he explores how God's eternal nature means that God created time itself. Let that sink in for a second. God didn't just create the universe, he created time. Before God said, "Let there be light," there wasn't even a clock ticking. Time didn't exist. Augustine is saying that time is part of God's creation, so he isn't limited by it like we are. Now, I know what you're thinking. Okay, cool. But how does this connect with me? Well, here's the kicker. This idea of God's eternal nature changes the whole way we see existence. If God is eternal, then he has the ultimate perspective. He's not just watching human history unfold like we do, one event after another. He sees it all, from beginning to end, in one sweep. That's how Christians believe God knows the future. He's already there. He's in every moment, simultaneously. Think about the implications of that. If God is eternal, then his knowledge is infinite. He doesn't just know things, he's already in the future. This is why, According to Christian theology, God's plan is so powerful. It's not just a blueprint he's following as events unfold. It's a plan that he's already seen the conclusion to because he exists at every point in time all at once. The Bible makes a bold claim that God is eternal. It's not just a nice idea, it's a fundamental part of Christian belief. And whether or not you believe it, it's hard to deny that this concept sets God apart from anything else in the universe. There's no origin story for God because, in Christian theology, he's the origin of everything else. Now, buckle up because this next one is going to really challenge how you think about existence itself. We're diving into the ontological argument, and trust me, this one's a game changer. First off, let's talk about Anselm of Canterbury, a medieval philosopher and theologian from the 11th century who didn't just sit around thinking small thoughts. This guy went all in on some of the biggest questions about God. Here's the core of Anselm's famous argument, known as the ontological argument. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Yeah, it sounds a bit mind-bendy, but stick with me. Anselm is saying that God, by definition, is the greatest possible being. He's so great that nothing greater can even be imagined. And here's the kicker. If God exists only in our minds, and not in reality, then we could imagine something greater, which is a God that exists in reality. But if we can imagine a greater being than the one that exists only in our minds, then the God in our minds isn't really God at all. In other words, the very concept of God demands that he exists in reality, because a God who exists in reality is greater than one who only exists as a thought or an idea. Anselm's point is simple, but absolutely huge. If you can conceive of God, then God must exist. If he didn't, he wouldn't be God, because the greatest possible being has to exist to actually be the greatest. Now I get it. This sounds pretty abstract, but this argument rocked medieval philosophy. And Anselm wasn't just spitballing here. This was carefully crafted logic meant to show that God's existence is a necessary truth, not just a possibility or a maybe. We're talking about a philosophical claim that says you can't even think about God without acknowledging his existence. It's bold, it's audacious, and yeah, it sparked some major debates. One of the most famous responses to Anselm came from Gournilot of Marmoutiers, a contemporary of Anselm. Gournilot wasn't buying it. He basically said, "Wait, Anselm, if I can imagine the greatest possible island, does that mean it has to exist?" In other words, Gournilot argued that just because you can imagine something doesn't mean it must exist in reality. He tried to expose what he thought was a flaw in Anselm's reasoning. You can't think something into existence. Gournilot's critique went down in history as one of the first real challenges to the ontological argument. But Anselm didn't flinch. He doubled down. His reply? God isn't like an island or any other thing you can imagine, because God is a necessary being. In Anselm's view, God is fundamentally different from anything else we could think about. He's not contingent on anything else for his existence. He has to exist by the very nature of what it means to be God. Fast forward to modern philosophy, and guess what? Anselm's argument is still a hot topic. Immanuel Kant, one of the most influential philosophers of the Enlightenment, took a swing at it. Kant didn't exactly love the ontological argument. He said that existence isn't a predicate, meaning it's not something you can just add to the definition of a thing to make it greater. He basically argued that existence isn't something you can include in the concept of God to prove he exists. But here's the wild part. Kant's criticism didn't kill Anselm's argument. In fact, it just made people argue about it more. Even today, philosophers like Alvin Plantinga have revisited the ontological argument with modern twists. Plantinga proposed a version using modal logic, a more sophisticated form of reasoning about possibility and necessity, which reignited the debate and kept this 1,000-year-old argument very much alive in contemporary philosophy. Now let's dive headfirst into one of the biggest questions people love to throw out there. Does God need a cause? The idea is simple enough. Everything we know in this universe seems to need a cause. A tree doesn't just spring up without a seed. A building doesn't just appear without someone building it. And you certainly didn't come into existence without your parents. But when it comes to God, things aren't quite so straightforward. In Christianity, the idea of causality, the need for something to be caused by something else, doesn't apply to God. Yeah, it sounds wild, but the entire foundation of Christian theology rests on the belief that God is different from everything else in existence. He doesn't need a cause, because he is the uncaused cause. This concept of God being the uncaused cause is rooted deep in Christian philosophy, going all the way back to the earliest church fathers. Take Athanasius of Alexandria, for example, a 4th century theologian who fiercely defended this very idea. Athanasius argued that God, by his very nature, is self-sufficient and doesn't depend on anything for his existence. He exists by his own power, and there's nothing before him, nothing above him. He's what theologians call aseti, which is just a fancy way of saying God exists in and of himself. This whole idea of God not needing a cause is tightly connected to his eternal nature, which means he isn't bound by time or space. Unlike everything else in the universe, God didn't begin at a certain point. He wasn't born into existence. Instead, God has always been there. So when people ask, who created God, it's like asking who created time itself. God is beyond creation. Let's bring in Aristotle for a second. Yeah, he wasn't a Christian, but his ideas laid a lot of the groundwork for Christian thought later on. Aristotle talked about the idea of the unmoved mover. It's the same concept in a lot of ways. He said that everything in motion needs something to set it in motion, but at some point you need something that started all that motion without itself being moved. And that, in Aristotle's mind, was the unmoved mover, the ultimate cause of everything that doesn't itself need a cause. When Christianity adopted this line of thinking, God became that ultimate mover, the uncaused cause behind the entire universe. You might be thinking, okay, but why doesn't God need a cause? Everything else does. Great question. Causality applies to things that have a beginning, things that come into existence at a particular point in time. But God, according to Christian belief, doesn't have a beginning. He's always been there. Genesis 1 verse 1 tells us, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Notice how it doesn't say anything about God being created. In fact, it just assumes God's existence as a given. He's there, ready to create. The Bible never talks about God being created because, in Christian theology, he wasn't. He's the one doing the creating. Enter Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century philosopher who took Aristotle's ideas and fused them with Christian thought in a way that's still discussed today. Aquinas developed his famous 5 ways of proving God's existence. And one of them is the argument from motion, which is directly linked to causality. Aquinas argues that everything in the universe is in motion, because it was set into motion by something else. But you can't keep going back infinitely. At some point, you need a starting point. That starting point, according to Aquinas, is God. God is the first cause, the unmoved mover, the one who sets everything in motion, but doesn't need anything to move him. So here's the key takeaway. God doesn't need a cause because he exists outside the chain of causes. He's not a part of the universe that operates under the rules of time and causality. He created those rules. It's like asking why the author of a book isn't bound by the fictional world they created. The author exists in a completely different realm. That's how God is described in Christian theology. He created time, space, and the laws that govern the universe, but he's not subject to them. And here's something you don't want to miss. The Bible is pretty clear on this point. One of the most famous verses on God's eternal and uncaused nature comes from Exodus 3 verse 14, when God speaks to Moses from the burning bush and declares, "I am who I am." It's a statement of self-existence. God is saying, I exist because I exist. I don't rely on anything else to be here. I just am. Okay, now we're getting into some serious intellectual territory, the Kalam cosmological argument. This is where science and theology go head to head, and it's one of the most compelling arguments for the existence of God in modern Christian apologetics. What makes it so interesting? It doesn't just rely on philosophical ideas. It pulls in scientific evidence and forces you to think about the very origins of the universe. So where did this all start? The Kalam argument isn't some brand new concept. It actually has its roots in medieval Islamic philosophy, but over the centuries, Christian thinkers have adapted it. Today, it's most famously championed by William Lane Craig, a contemporary philosopher and theologian who has debated some of the biggest names in atheism. This argument has become one of the go-to points in debates about God's existence, and it's easy to see why. It's smart, scientific, and incredibly hard to dismiss. The Kalam cosmological argument is built on a simple premise. It goes like this. 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Seems straightforward, right? But when you unpack each part, you start to see how deep this argument really goes. Let's break it down. The first premise, everything that begins to exist has a cause, is something that no one really argues with. It's basically common sense. You don't expect a house to just appear out of nowhere. You don't think your car randomly popped into existence. If something exists and it had a beginning, it must have had a cause. Science agrees with this, and so does everyday experience, so no one's fighting on this one. But here's where things get spicy. The second premise, the universe began to exist. This is where the Big Bang theory comes into play. Yeah, we're talking about that same Big Bang you've heard about in science class. In 1927, astronomer Georges Lemaitre, who was also a Catholic priest, by the way, first proposed the idea that the universe is expanding, and in 1965 scientists discovered cosmic microwave background radiation, which is essentially leftover radiation from the Big Bang, the moment the universe started expanding from an incredibly dense point. This gave scientists solid evidence that the universe did have a beginning, just like the Bible says in Genesis 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, here's where the Kalam argument really hits home. If the universe had a beginning, it must have had a cause. Nothing comes from nothing, right? If the universe began to exist, something had to cause that beginning. But it couldn't have been something inside the universe, because the universe didn't exist yet. So what kind of cause could bring the universe into existence? That's where God comes in. The Kalam argument points to a cause that is outside of time, space, and matter, because those things didn't exist before the universe began. The cause has to be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and incredibly powerful. That sure sounds a lot like the Christian concept of God, doesn't it? William Lane Craig has debated some of the most famous atheists on this point, and the Kalam argument has proven to be a tough one to refute. Even those who don't believe in God struggle with the implications of a universe that had a beginning. Stephen Hawking, one of the most brilliant minds in modern science, once said, "Almost everyone now believes that the universe, and time itself, had a beginning at the Big Bang. But then the question becomes, what caused the Big Bang?" Some people might argue, well, maybe the universe came from nothing. But scientifically speaking, nothing doesn't really mean nothing. Even in a vacuum, there's still quantum activity going on. Plus, if the universe did come from nothing, that would be the exception to the rule that everything that begins to exist has a cause, which would throw everything we know about the universe into chaos. Not a very satisfying answer, is it? But let's say for a moment that the universe could come from nothing. Why did it come into existence at that exact moment and not at some other time? There had to be a cause that chose to bring it into existence. That cause, according to the Kalam argument, is God. What's brilliant about this argument is how it uses modern science to support the idea of a creator. The Big Bang is one of the most well-established theories in cosmology, and it lines up perfectly with the idea that the universe had a definite beginning. Even Einstein's theory of general relativity, which describes how gravity works on a cosmic scale, suggests that time and space are intertwined and had a starting point. If science tells us that the universe had a beginning, then it must also tell us that something outside the universe caused it. And don't forget, Christian theology has been saying this for over 2,000 years. The Bible starts with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That's a pretty clear statement about the universe having a beginning, long before scientists figured out that the universe wasn't eternal. All right, time to go way back in history. We've talked about modern philosophers and scientists, but now it's time to dive into some of the earliest minds of the Christian church, the Church Fathers. These were the intellectual heavyweights of their time, shaping much of what we now understand as Christian theology. And they had a lot to say about the nature of God, especially when it came to his existence. Let's start with one of the most important figures, Athanasius of Alexandria. This guy was a 4th century bishop in Egypt, and he didn't mess around when it came to defending the idea that God has no beginning and no end. In his work on the Incarnation, Athanasius emphasized that God exists outside of creation. God is above all things created, he wrote, insisting that while everything else in the universe was made, God simply is. He doesn't rely on anything else to exist, and his nature is eternal, existing before time itself. What's really fascinating about Athanasius is that he was battling Arianism, a major heresy at the time that claimed Jesus was created by God and therefore not equal to him. Athanasius stood firm, arguing that both God the Father and Jesus were co-eternal, meaning they had no beginning. This was a groundbreaking defense of God's eternal nature, and it's a belief that still holds strong in Christian doctrine today. But Athanasius wasn't the only one tackling the tough questions about God's existence. Let's talk about Origen, one of the greatest theological minds of the early church. Born in 185 AD, Origen lived in Alexandria too, and if you know anything about ancient Alexandria, you know it was the intellectual center of the ancient world, like the Ivy League of the time. Origen was all about blending philosophy with theology, and his writings made huge strides in helping early Christians understand the nature of God. Origen's key argument: God is incomprehensible. In other words, humans, no matter how hard we try, will never fully understand God. In his work on First Principles, Origen wrote, "God cannot be contained by the universe, nor by any place, nor by anything external to him." What he was saying is that God's existence is so far beyond our understanding that we can't even begin to comprehend it. And this is important because it highlights a key part of early Christian thought: the mystery of God's existence. You can't box God in, you can't put limits on him, and that's what makes him God. He exists outside of anything we can grasp with our finite minds. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential Christian thinkers of all time, picked up where Origen left off. Born in 354 AD, Augustine is famous for his writings on time, creation, and the nature of God. One of his most influential works, Confessions, dives deep into the idea that God created time itself. Augustine argued that God exists outside of time, meaning he's not bound by past, present, or future like we are. He wrote, "For you are the creator of all times, and before all times you are, and no time is co-eternal with you." What's mind-blowing here is that Augustine was talking about these things long before modern science even had a clue about the origins of the universe. He anticipated the idea that time itself is a creation, which lines up with what we now know from Einstein's theory of relativity, that time and space are intertwined and had a beginning. Augustine was way ahead of his time, showing that even the most ancient Christian thinkers were grappling with concepts that still challenge us today. These early church fathers weren't just trying to make abstract philosophical points. They were fighting real battles against heresies, against competing worldviews, and even against their own limitations of understanding. But their work laid the foundation for how Christians today think about God's existence. God isn't just the biggest or most powerful being we can think of. He's beyond all categories of existence. He's not just the cause of the universe. He's outside the universe altogether. He exists because he is the very definition of existence. What's fascinating is that the Nicene Creed, which was established in 325 AD and is still recited in many Christian churches today, embodies a lot of the ideas these church fathers fought for. It opens with, "We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible." This one sentence sums up the belief that God created everything, both what we can see and what we can't see, and that he exists outside of it all. One of the things that really stands out about the church fathers is their boldness. They weren't afraid to challenge the philosophical and religious ideas of their day, even when those ideas were deeply embedded in the culture. People like Athanasius and Augustine were standing up to massive opposition, but they stuck to their guns because they believed that understanding God's eternal nature wasn't just a theological point. It was foundational to everything else Christians believe. God's existence isn't just about a philosophical or scientific argument. It's part of a bigger plan for humanity. If you've been following along this far, you already know that Christian theology teaches that God exists outside of time, space, and the universe itself. But here's the thing. His existence is tied directly to our existence. From the very beginning, the Bible frames humanity's story as one of relationship between the Creator and his creation. In Genesis 1 verse 26 we read, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." This shows right from the start that humans aren't just accidents of nature. We're purposefully made in the image of a Creator who exists outside of all the limitations we face, and yet is intimately involved in our world. But here's where it gets really deep. The existence of God is central to the concept of free will, moral responsibility, and the destiny of humanity. Think about it. Without God, who defines what is right or wrong? What's the ultimate purpose of life? If everything in the universe is just random particles colliding, then what does it even mean to live a meaningful life? According to Christian belief, God's eternal existence gives meaning to our choices, our struggles, and our purpose. It's not just that God created the universe and left us to figure it out on our own. The Bible reveals a much bigger picture, one where God has been guiding humanity from the very beginning, offering us the choice to follow him, to live with purpose, and to eventually share in his eternal life. One of the clearest examples of this bigger plan comes from the New Testament. John 3 verse 16 gives us a direct link between God's existence and our future. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life." This verse isn't just about the afterlife. It's about God's eternal existence intersecting with ours in the most powerful way possible. Through Jesus, God made a way for humanity to share in his eternal existence. In other words, our destiny is tied to God's eternity. Now, one person who really captured this idea was C.S. Lewis, the brilliant 20th century Christian writer and thinker. In his book Mere Christianity, Lewis talks about how God's eternal nature makes it possible for him to be present in every moment of our lives, past, present, and future. He said, "For God, time itself is a present reality. He is in all times at once, and that is how he can hear your prayers today, even as he was creating the world in the beginning." It's a mind-blowing idea. God's eternal existence means he's involved in every single moment of your life, guiding and offering you the chance to be part of his bigger plan. But here's the thing, this plan isn't forced on us. God's existence gives us the freedom to choose. The Bible makes it clear that God created us with the ability to make real choices. In Deuteronomy 30 verse 19, God says, "I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live." This is a pivotal point in understanding God's relationship with humanity. He exists eternally, but he gives us the freedom to choose whether to walk with him or walk away. The key takeaway here is that God's existence isn't just about explaining the origins of the universe. It's about explaining the ultimate purpose of life. The fact that God is eternal means that our lives have a direction, a destination, and a purpose that goes beyond just surviving. It's about growing, learning, and stepping into the bigger story that God has been writing since the beginning of time. So, where does that leave us? We've talked about philosophy, science, history, and theology, but it all boils down to this: God's eternal existence is the foundation of everything. It's not just a belief, it's a way of understanding why we're here and where we're going. Whether you're a person of faith or still figuring things out, the idea of an eternal God who's deeply connected to humanity's journey is something that's worth exploring. It's an idea that shaped human history, and it continues to give people hope and purpose today. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this journey. If you're still watching, we really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment below with your thoughts, and of course, don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. We've got more exciting topics coming your way, so stay tuned. God bless you all.